Hi guys, hi, hello. Today, what we got going on today is we're going to be talking about, we're starting a new decade, getting into the 1980s of America, which is something that your parents are probably much more well versed in. In thinking about kind of where they're at and what's happening. They'll start to know more about this part of your learning and education in American studies than some of our previous stuff, I would say. So we're going to just dive right in. You should grab your notebooks out. We're going to talk about that lovely man in the dark jacket right there, one Mr. Ronald Reagan, who at the time of his election had been the oldest elected president until Donald Trump was. So we're going to talk about Reaganomics, but before that, we should briefly discuss the election, and it really is a brief discussion because the election of 1980 was, again, a total and complete failure for Jimmy Carter. He had, during his one term in office, tried really hard. Unfortunately, there was a lot of things working against him. The country was still feeling a lot of the fallout from the earlier decades, and of course the conflict in Vietnam was still fresh, and the fact that our country as a nation was still very divided between right and left, and again, the fight for civil rights and all of that stuff, it really hurt Jimmy Carter's time in office. So in 1980, in reaction to a lot of the big changes that had gone on, the country was looking for someone more conservative. And Ronald Reagan, as the conservative Republican candidate, comes in and he, man, oh man, just wipes out the competition. Ronald Reagan will be elected, and George H.W. Bush, again, George W. Bush's father, will be his vice president for the next, 8 years, and we'll talk about that briefly. Of course, the largest and most important aspect of the campaigning that year has to do with the economy. Our economy by the end of the 1970s was still firmly rooted in recession. We were really struggling. The standard of living had dropped dramatically in our nation. So when Reagan is again running for office, he talks a lot about something that becomes known as Reaganomics, which is ultimately his economic plan to try and fix the country. One of the first big things that he wants to do is shrink the size of the federal government. Nixon tried to do this, or he did this at least at first. So budget cuts happen. You're going to kind of see some trends, and again, this is not necessarily rooted in prejudice, but it does have an unfair effect on certain groups of our country. So the areas of the federal government that are going to get cut as far as budgeting goes are going to be the programs that benefit the lowest in the nation. So things like federal funding for urban mass transit and food stamps and welfare and federally provided school lunches, things like that are going to get cut. But other programs which have a lot more, again, impact on the middle class of America are going to get left alone. Social Security, Medicare, veterans pensions, things like that. As far as we go. The other side of this is going to be tax cuts. It's a pretty famous aspect of Reagan's tenure in office, slashing taxes in a lot of different places, specifically to large corporations and the wealthiest of the country. The reason tax cuts were such an integral part of Reaganomics is this economic phenomenon referred to as supply-side economics. The idea here is not, I mean, again, it's logical in nature. The fact that if you are taking less taxes from individuals, that they have more money staying on their paycheck every month, and they'll feel more comfortable spending that money. And that money, of course, would start to kind of spark the economy and get things moving overall. Again, the other side of this is trickle-down economics, which is if corporations are not having to pay taxes, they're going to be able to be more successful and hire more people, and more people being hired is going to allow for that, again, the economy to success-wise trickle down to everybody. Reaganomics on the whole is what your assignment that you're going to see posted today is about. And it's still a pretty, again, highly debated, again, aspect of American economics, just because there's evidence that it was good for our economy at this time, and then there is, of course, evidence that it wasn't. So before we get to that, though, the other part of Reaganomics, as far as economics goes, is that the budget is going to shrink in all of those programs, but it is going to get poured into our defense spending. In one particular item that Reagan is going to be fairly proud of is the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, or Star Wars. They tried to nickname it Star Wars because, again, not that long ago, the massively successful first movie, A New Hope, came out in the United States. So they wanted to jazz it up so that the young people would be excited about this. Again, this system was meant to try and basically alert us faster if an enemy were to shoot missiles at us. This defense spending program, trillions of dollars were being poured into this particular item. It was not cheap, that is for sure. What we're going to see here is that when Reagan first comes into office and he starts enacting these various different elements, the economy does dip. It takes another few steps closer to that scary aspect that is depression, but suddenly it flips around and it starts to rise, and that rise is going to continue throughout most of Reagan's time in office. And that's why, again, some people think that maybe this is due to Reagan's programming, and some people are like, no, maybe not. Again, that's where the debate or argument comes in. Regardless, through all of this, specifically with the defense spending, the national debt, it continues to grow. Other things that are going to be, I guess, important to understanding Reagan's time in office is that there is going to be, excuse me, another turnover happen in the Supreme Court. I remember during Nixon's time that there was, again, a kind of changing of the guard. And during Reagan's time, this also sort of lines up where he's going to be able to create or curate a Supreme Court that is much more conservative, matches more what the voters for Reagan were looking for in this time period. And obviously it also means that if he passes programs that he'll have an easier time getting them through all the way, because the Supreme Court will support him through and through. So Reagan's going to nominate 4 different people who will get, again, basically overall put on here. You got Sandra Day O'Connor, who will be the very first woman to serve on the Supreme Court as a judge. And there's Antonin Scalia, Anthony M. Kennedy, and then William Rehnquist, who is considered to be the most conservative justice out of them all. He'll be promoted to the Chief Justice, so he'll be running things. While this conservative Supreme Court is reigning in our nation, they're going to revisit a handful of different constitutional issues and reverse certain rulings and change their stance on things. So discrimination will come in front of them again, the issue of abortion, the controversy with affirmative action. A lot of the decisions that end up getting passed in this conservative Supreme Court are going to limit a lot of the fighting for rights that happened throughout the 1950s and 60s into the 70s. So civil rights will be a little bit more restricted. Women's rights are going to get more restricted again. The rights of accused persons, the Miranda rights, that also is going to get reevaluated and restricted once again. I'm not saying it's total reversal, but it is making things more difficult on the whole. The other piece of this that goes along with Reagan's time in office is this idea of deregulation, right? This helps to shrink the size of the federal government, which allows for budget cuts to be easier. The other thing about this is it's trying to loosen the reins and to create more free market, to hold the I guess, the ever watchful eyes of the federal government away from certain industries to let them do what they have to in order to become more successful. Again, there's good and bad to all of these ideas or these approaches that Reagan is going to put together. In this one, he's going to remove price controls on oil. So American oil, they're going to be able to again, the private industries are going to be able to make decisions for themselves about pricing. They're going to eliminate federal health and safety inspections in various different industries. One that always stands out to me and kind of makes me shudder is the nursing homes. Again, the federal government have been in charge of making sure nursing homes are treating everyone well, and now they're not going to do that. It's going to be up to the privately owned and industries to do that. Deregulating the airline industry. So you're going to see the whole airline industry is going to change during this time period. Savings and loan will change. They cut the EPA funding, again, the Environmental Protection Agency, which is, again, it's stressful on the environment because they were the only ones kind of like the watchdogs for it. It does increase competition because private companies now are not restricted by so much, so they have more control over what they do. And it does have a positive impact on pricing because consumers, when there is more competition, they have to fight for it. So they drive down prices, and then of course that is seen by the consumer, and they're going to buy those certain things. And again, good and bad. We see some really positive stuff here, and we obviously can see where things could get not so nice. I'm going to quickly talk about the election of '84. This was a really simple election when '84 came around, even with some of the hiccups, and we'll talk about those tomorrow. That during Reagan's time in office, thinking on a larger scale, overall, again, this landslide victory by Reagan and Bush. Again, there's this large conservative coalition of supporters. Again, the business people, Southerners, Westerners, there's Democrats who are Reagan Democrats. They ran against Carter's VP, Walter Mondale, and Geraldine Ferrero, who was the first woman to run for a executive branch office like the vice president. In '88, of course, Reagan can't stay. After FDR, they put the rule out there that presidents can only serve 2 terms. But in '88, the country was on a good track. Economically, we were bouncing back. Again, under Reagan, we had felt like we'd kind of earned back a little bit more of our status. And George H.W. Bush will run on his own platform for president. He really just builds on Reagan's legacy. His big campaign slogan is "No new taxes." He's got the support of the moral majority. He is a kind of a gentler, kinder version of Reagan, even though his campaign ads during this time were pretty ruthless. Overall, again, the fact that his opponent was soft on crime, unpatriotic, all these different things. This is an interesting kind of moment in American voting history, though, because this is the lowest voter turnout in 64 years. And a lot of people make the connection that people didn't turn up to vote because they didn't think anyone could beat HW. There was no point in going to vote if their other candidate wasn't going to win, which of course kind of defeats the whole democratic process thing. But it was how we were in this moment in time, and it unfortunately sets off a trend in the coming years for sure. Right? Whew. With that said and done. Again, you guys should be checking every day for new notes and lectures and stuff. Today, you've got something due, which is your active reading. You had to read that section of Silent Spring and Love Canal actively, so highlighting comments and then little summaries. And then you'll see posted today that there is a new assignment for Reaganomics. It's going to look at a handful of different sources. You're going to be collecting evidence. 10 pieces total, 5 for, 5 against, and then choosing one side to write up a claim evidence analysis paragraph. Again, you're trying to evaluate if Reagan's economic plan was good or bad. So that's kind of the idea here. And again, I'm looking and challenging you to think very critically about it using the evidence. At the end of the week, we are having an assessment. This has obviously been a really fast unit. So the assessment itself is smaller, more streamlined, I suppose. It's a Google form. It's open the same window as it's always been. There'll be a little review packet that's online for you guys if you're looking for something, some kind of guidance. And make sure you're emailing me with questions. Otherwise, I hope you guys have a good day.